Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is opening a cold beer after a long day. It's such an ordinary thing that nobody thinks twice about it. But you're not doing something modern. You're repeating a ritual so old that it predates farming, predates writing, predates almost everything you'd call civilization. Your ancestors were getting drunk before they learned how to grow food. Think about that for a second. Before the first field was ever planted, before anyone lived in a village, before we baked our first loaf of bread, humans were already brewing alcohol. So the question is, when did that start? And why on earth would a species that was barely surviving decide that what it really needed was a drink? To find the answer, we have to go back further than any human. Much further. Here's something strange about your body. You are unusually good at handling alcohol. Not good as in you can win a drinking contest. Good as in your liver has a specialized enzyme that breaks down ethanol far more efficiently than most animals. That's a weirdly specific ability. Evolution doesn't hand out expensive upgrades for no reason. So where did it come from? The answer, according to biologist Robert Dudley, is fruit. Rotten fruit. Millions of years ago, our ape ancestors lived among fruit trees. And fruit doesn't just sit there being perfect. It falls, it splits open, wild yeast lands on the sugar inside, and it begins to ferment. That means every overripe piece of fruit on the forest floor contained a small amount of alcohol. Now, if you're a hungry ape, that faint boozy smell is incredibly useful. It's a signal. It says sugar over here, calories over here, ripe food right now. The apes that could smell ethanol from a distance and then digest it without getting sick found more food. They survived, they had more offspring, and slowly, across millions of years, a taste for alcohol was written into the family line. Dudley calls it the drunken monkey hypothesis. The idea is uncomfortable and fascinating at the same time. The reason alcohol feels good to you might be because, for your ancestors, it meant dinner was ready. And the timing works. Scientists traced the mutation that made our ancestors far better at processing ethanol, and it appears roughly 10 million years ago, right around the time our ancestors were spending more time on the ground where the fallen, fermenting fruit was. The bodies that could handle a little alcohol got the free calories nobody else could stomach. The ones that couldn't went hungry. 10 million years later, that ancient adaptation is still sitting in your liver, quietly doing its job every time you drink. And this isn't just theory. Wild chimpanzees have been observed drinking fermented palm sap, soaking it up with crumpled leaves, and drinking until some of them behave, let's say, differently. Nobody taught them that. The pull toward alcohol is older than our species. But there's a huge gap between an ape eating a fermented plum and a human deliberately making beer. Eating booze by accident is one thing. Sitting down and manufacturing it is another. Somewhere between those two moments, humans crossed a line. So when? For a long time, the story went like this. Humans invented farming. Farming produced extra grain. Extra grain sat around, got wet, accidentally fermented, and boom, beer. Alcohol was an accident, a happy little byproduct of civilization. It's a clean story. It's also, quite possibly, backwards. In 2018, a team from Stanford, led by archaeologist Li Lu, was studying a cave in northern Israel called Raqefet Cave. This wasn't a home. It was a graveyard, a burial site used by a people called the Natufians, hunter-gatherers who lived in the region between roughly 15,000 and 11,500 years ago. They were remarkable. They buried their dead carefully, on beds of flowers. Inside the cave were stone mortars carved into the rock. And when the team analyzed the residue trapped in them, they found something they weren't even looking for. Microscopic traces of starch and plant particles that only appear when wheat and barley are turned into alcohol. Those mortars are 13,000 years old. That's beer, brewed in a cave 13,000 years ago. It is the oldest evidence of man-made alcohol ever found. And here is why it upended everything. Before this, the earliest hard evidence for brewing came from northern China, and it was about 5,000 years younger. 5,000 years. That's the gap this cave erased in a single study. One of the researchers said that in archaeology, things are rarely clear-cut. But in this case, every piece of evidence pointed the same way. Farming came later. Wheat and barley weren't properly domesticated in that region until roughly 2,000 to 3,000 years after those mortars were used. The Naafians were not farmers. They were foragers, gathering wild grain by hand and turning it into beer, which means beer didn't come after bread. Beer came first. Let that reorder your mental timeline. For years, we imagined a straight line. Farming, then surplus, then villages, then alcohol as the reward at the end. Instead, people who had no farms, no fields, and no permanent homes were doing the hard, deliberate work of brewing. And it was hard. This is the part people miss. Fruit ferments by itself. Crush it, wait, done. Grain does not. Starch will not turn into alcohol on its own. You have to sprout the grain, then heat it, then mash it, then let it ferment in stages. With knowledge passed between people, it's a genuine technology. Someone had to figure it out, remember it, and teach it. So a group of hunter-gatherers, whose entire lives revolved around finding enough calories to survive tomorrow, chose to spend their time and precious grain making something that gives you no nutrition you couldn't get more easily by just eating the grain. Why? Why would they bother? Because here's the thing. If you're starving, beer is a terrible investment. You take grain that could feed you today, you soak it, sprout it, heat it, mash it, and then you wait. And at the end, you get a drink with fewer calories than the grain you started with. From a pure survival standpoint, brewing is close to madness, which tells you something profound. Whatever they were getting out of it, it wasn't nutrition. It was worth more to them than food. Here's what makes this so important. The answer isn't that they wanted to party. The answer is far stranger and far more human. Remember where the mortars were found? Not in a kitchen, in a graveyard. Li Liu's team concluded that the Natufians were brewing beer for ritual feasts, gatherings to honor their dead. The first alcohol we can prove humans made wasn't for pleasure. It was for grief, for ceremony, for the moment when a community stood together over someone they had lost. Think about what that means. 13,000 years ago, people buried a loved one on a bed of flowers, and then they gathered and they drank together. A funeral, a wake. It is almost unbearably familiar. That impulse to mark death by coming together and to reach for something that loosens the tongue and softens the edges is 13,000 years old at minimum. And now the truly wild idea. If brewing beer required grain, and gathering wild grain by hand is slow, backbreaking work, what if that's the reason we started planting it? This is one of the great arguments in archaeology, and it's been debated for over 70 years. Some researchers propose that the thirst for beer, for ritual, for the feasts that held communities together, was one of the pressures that pushed humans toward growing cereals on purpose. Not hunger, not bread. In other words, maybe we didn't invent farming to feed ourselves. Maybe we invented farming, at least partly, so we'd never run out of beer. Now be careful here, because this is a hypothesis, not a settled fact. Plenty of archaeologists disagree, and they have good reasons. Grain gives you food, and food is a powerful motivator all by itself. The honest answer is that we don't know which came first in people's minds, the loaf or the drink. What we do know is that the two arrived tangled together at the exact moment human life changed forever. And once it started, it never stopped. Beer shows up in ancient Mesopotamia as everyday food and wages. Wine appears across the ancient world. Every civilization, on every continent, independently found something to ferment. Grapes, rice, honey, agave, milk, corn. If it could ferment, someone made a drink out of it. That's not a coincidence. That's a species doing what it has always done. So here's the full picture. Millions of years ago, apes learned to smell alcohol in fallen fruit and eat it without getting sick. That taste stayed with us. 13,000 years ago, hunter-gatherers in a cave in Israel deliberately brewed beer, not to celebrate but to mourn, thousands of years before anyone planted a seed. And that thirst may have helped pull our entire species toward agriculture, toward villages, toward everything that came next. Which brings us back to right now, to that ordinary beer at the end of a long day, to the glass raised at a wedding, or a funeral, or a Tuesday. You're not doing something modern, you're doing something so old it's practically wired into you. A habit inherited from apes in the trees, refined in a cave beside the dead, carried through every civilization that ever existed, all the way to the drink in your hand. Humans have been reaching for the same thing for a very long time. Not the alcohol, really. The company. If this made you look at your drink a little differently, you know what to do. I'll see you in the next one.